Section 18 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 18. But she had to write, and one letter to the Times, she used to say to Miss Brush, cost her more than to organise an expedition to South Africa, which she had done in the war. After a morning's battle beginning, tearing up, beginning again, she used to feel the futility of her own womanhood as she felt it on no other occasion, and would turn gratefully to the thought of Hugh Whitbread, who possessed, no one could doubt it, the art of writing letters to the Times. A being so differently constituted from herself, with such a command of language, able to put things as editors like them put, had passions which one could not call simply greed. Lady Bruton often suspended judgment upon men in deference to the mysterious accord in which they, but no woman, stood to the laws of the universe, knew how to put things, knew what was said, so that if Richard advised her, and Hugh wrote for her, she was sure of being somehow right. So she let Hugh eat his souffle, asked after poor Evelyn, waited until they were smoking, and then said, "Milly, would you fetch the papers?" And Miss Brush went out, came back, laid papers on the table, and Hugh produced his fountain pen, his silver fountain pen, which had done 20 years' service, he said, unscrewing the cap. It was still in perfect order. He had shown it to the makers. There was no reason, they said, why it should ever wear out, which was somehow to Hugh's credit, and to the credit of the sentiments which his pen expressed, so Richard Dalloway felt, as Hugh began carefully writing capital letters with rings round them in the margin, and thus marvellously reduced Lady Bruton's tangles to sense, to grammar, such as the editor of the Times, Lady Bruton felt, watching the marvellous transformation, must respect. Hugh was slow. Hugh was pertinacious. Richard said one must take risks. Hugh proposed modifications in deference to people's feelings, which, he said rather tartly when Richard laughed, had to be considered, and read out how, therefore, we are of opinion that the times are ripe, the superfluous youth of our ever-increasing population, what we owe to the dead, which Richard thought all stuffing and bunkum, but no harm in it, of course. And Hugh went on drafting sentiments in alphabetical order of the highest nobility, brushing the cigar ash from his waistcoat, and summing up now and then the progress they had made, until finally he read out the draft of a letter which Lady Bruton felt certain was a masterpiece. Could her own meaning sound like that? Hugh could not guarantee that the editor would put it in, but he would be meeting somebody at luncheon. Whereupon Lady Bruton, who seldom did a graceful thing, stuffed all Hugh's carnations into the front of her dress, and flinging her hands out, called him "My Prime Minister." What she would have done without them both she did not know. They rose, and Richard Dalloway strolled off as usual to have a look at the General's portrait, because he meant, whenever he had a moment of leisure, to write a history of Lady Bruton's family. And Millicent Bruton was very proud of her family. But they could wait, she said, looking at the picture, meaning that her family, of military men, administrators, admirals, had been men of action, who had done their duty. And Richard's first duty was to his country, but it was a fine face, she said, and all the papers were ready for Richard down at Aldmixton whenever the time came, the Labour government, she meant. "Ah, the news from India!" she cried. And then, as they stood in the hall taking yellow gloves from the bowl on the malachite table, and Hugh was offering Miss Brush with quite unnecessary courtesy some discarded ticket or other compliment, which she loathed from the depths of her heart and blushed brick red, Richard turned to Lady Bruton with his hat in his hand and said, "We shall see you at our party tonight." Whereupon Lady Bruton resumed the magnificence which letter-writing had shattered. She might come or she might not come. Clarissa had wonderful energy. Parties terrified Lady Bruton. But then she was getting old. So she intimated, standing at her doorway, handsome, very erect, while her chow stretched behind her, and Miss Brush disappeared into the background with her hands full of papers. And Lady Bruton went ponderously, majestically, up to her room, lay, one arm extended on the sofa. She sighed, she snored, not that she was asleep, only drowsy and heavy, like a field of clover in the sunshine this hot June day, with the bees going round and about, and the yellow butterflies. Always she went back to those fields down in Devonshire, where she had jumped the brooks on Patty, her pony, with Mortimer and Tom, her brothers. And there were the dogs, There were the rats. There were her father and mother on the lawn under the trees, with the tea-things out, and the beds of dahlias, the hollyhocks, the pampas grass, and they, little wretches, always up to some mischief, stealing back through the shrubbery so as not to be seen, all bedraggled from some roguery. What old nurse used to say about her frocks? Ah, dear, she remembered. It was Wednesday in Brook Street. Those kind good fellows, Richard Dalloway, Hugh Whitbread, had gone this hot day through the streets, whose growl came up to her lying on the sofa. Power was hers, position, income. She had lived in the forefront of her time. She had had good friends, known the ablest men of her day. Murmuring London flowed up to her, and her hand, lying on the sofa back, curled upon some imaginary baton such as her grandfather's might have held, holding which she seemed, drowsy and heavy, to be commanding battalions marching to Canada, and those good fellows walking across London, that territory of theirs, that little bit of carpet, Mayfair. And they went further and further from her, being attached to her by a thin thread, since they had lunched with her, which would stretch and stretch, get thinner and thinner as they walked across London, as if one's friends were attached to one's body after lunching with them by a thin thread which, as she dozed there, became hazy with the sound of bells, striking the hour or ringing to service, as a single spider's thread is blotted with raindrops and burdened, sags down. So she slept. And Richard Dalloway and Hugh Whitbread hesitated at the corner of Conduit Street at the very moment that Millicent Bruton, lying on the sofa, let the thread snap, snored. Contrary winds buffeted at the street corner. They looked in at a shop window. They did not wish to buy or to talk, but to part. Only with contrary winds buffeting the street corner, with some sort of lapse in the tides of the body, two forces meeting in a swirl, morning and afternoon, they paused. Some newspaper placard went up in the air, gallantly, like a kite at first, then paused, swooped, fluttered, and a lady's veil hung. Yellow awnings trembled. The speed of the morning traffic slackened, and single carts rattled carelessly down half-empty streets. In Norfolk, of which Richard Dalloway was half thinking, a soft warm wind blew back the petals, confused the waters, ruffled the flowering grasses. Haymakers who had pitched beneath hedges to sleep away the morning toil, parted curtains of green blades, moving trembling globes of cow parsley to see the sky, the blue, the steadfast, the blazing summer sky. Aware that he was looking at a silver two-handled Jacobean mug, and that Hugh Whitbread admired condescendingly with airs of connoisseurship a Spanish necklace which he thought of asking the price of in case Evelyn might like it. Still Richard was torpid, could not think or move. Life had thrown up this wreckage, shop windows full of coloured paste, and one stood stark with the lethargy of the old, stiff with the rigidity of the old, looking in. Evelyn Whitbread might like to buy this Spanish necklace, so she might. Yawn he must. Hugh was going into the shop. "Right you are," said Richard, following. Goodness knows he didn't want to go buying necklaces with Hugh, but there are tides in the body. Morning meets afternoon, born like a frail shallop on deep, deep floods. Lady Bruton's great-grandfather and his memoir and his campaigns in North America were whelmed and sunk. And Millicent Bruton, too, she went under. Richard didn't care a straw what became of emigration, about that letter, whether the editor put it in or not. The necklace hung stretched between Hugh's admirable fingers. Let him give it to a girl, if he must buy jewels. Any girl in the street. For the worthlessness of this life did strike Richard pretty forcibly, buying necklaces for Evelyn. If he'd had a boy, he'd have said, work, work. But he had his Elizabeth. He adored his Elizabeth. "I should like to see Mr. Dubonnet," said Hugh in his curt, worldly way. It appeared that this Dubonnet had the measurements of Mrs. Whitbread's neck, or, more strangely still, knew her views upon Spanish jewellery and the extent of her possessions in that line, which Hugh could not remember. All of which seemed to Richard Dalloway awfully odd, for he never gave Clarissa presents, except a bracelet 2 or 3 years ago, which had not been a success. She never wore it. It pained him to remember that she never wore it. And as a single spider's thread, after wavering here and there, attaches itself to the point of a leaf, so Richard's mind, recovering from its lethargy, set now on his wife, Clarissa, whom Peter Walsh had loved so passionately, and Richard had had a sudden vision of her there at luncheon, of himself and Clarissa, of their life together, and he drew the tray of old jewels towards him, and taking up first this brooch, then that ring. "How much is that?" he asked, but doubted his own taste. He wanted to open the drawing-room door and come in holding out something, a present for Clarissa. Only what? But Hugh was on his legs again. He was unspeakably pompous. Really, after dealing here for 35 years, he was not going to be put off by a mere boy who did not know his business. For Dubonnet, it seemed, was out, and Hugh would not buy anything until Mr. Dubonnet chose to be in, at which the youth flushed and bowed his correct little bow. It was all perfectly correct. And yet Richard couldn't have said that to save his life. Why these people stood that damned insolence he could not conceive. Hugh was becoming an intolerable ass. Richard Dalloway could not stand more than an hour of his society, and flicking his bowler hat by way of farewell, Richard turned at the corner of Conduit Street, eager, yes, very eager, to travel that spider's thread of attachment between himself and Clarissa. He would go straight to her, in Westminster. But he wanted to come in holding something. Flowers? Yes, flowers, since he did not trust his taste in gold. Any number of flowers, roses, orchids, to celebrate what was, reckoning things as you will, an event. This feeling about her when they spoke of Peter Walsh at luncheon, and they never spoke of it, not for years had they spoken of it, which, he thought, grasping his red and white roses together, a vast bunch in tissue paper, is the greatest mistake in the world. The time comes when it can't be said. One's too shy to say it, he thought, pocketing his sixpence or two of change, setting off with his great bunch held against his body to Westminster to say straight out in so many words, whatever she might think of him, holding out his flowers, "I love you." Why not? Really, it was a miracle, thinking of the war, and thousands of poor chaps, with all their lives before them, shovelled together, already half forgotten. It was a miracle. Here he was walking across London to say to Clarissa in so many words that he loved her, which one never does say, he thought. Partly one's lazy, partly one's shy. And Clarissa, it was difficult to think of her, except in starts, as at luncheon, when he saw her quite distinctly. Their whole life. He stopped at the crossing and repeated, being simple by nature and undebauched, because he had tramped and shot, being pertinacious and dogged, having championed the downtrodden and followed his instincts in the House of Commons, being preserved in his simplicity, yet at the same time grown rather speechless, rather stiff. He repeated that it was a miracle that he should have married Clarissa, a miracle. His life had been a miracle, he thought, hesitating to cross. But it did make his blood boil to see little creatures of 5 or 6 crossing Piccadilly alone. The police ought to have stopped the traffic at once. He had no illusions about the London police. Indeed, he was collecting evidence of their malpractices, and those costermongers not allowed to stand their barrows in the streets, and prostitutes, good Lord, the fault wasn't in them, nor in young men either, but in our detestable social system, and so forth. All of which he considered, could be seen considering, grey, dogged, dapper, clean, as he walked across the park to tell his wife that he loved her. End of section 18, read by Hannah Dormer, London, 14th of August 2021.